Welcome back. So today I'm going to start a piece that I hope is going to be the first in a body of work. This is something that I talk about a lot with painters, this idea of there being a clear process. So you don't just kind of go into the studio and sit down and say, like, I wonder what I'll paint today. Instead, you get a really clear goal in mind for what it is you want to produce. You identify what your skill gaps are and being able to actually paint that way. And then you sit down, you bridge those skill gaps, so you do the work to get your art to where it really needs to be. And then the final step in all of this is when you have your skills to where they need to be, well, you go into production mode and you actually produce painting after painting using those new capabilities. So, over the weekend, I was looking at some artwork and thinking about what it is that I would really like to be able to paint. And this is an ongoing process for me. So just because I make and teach art for a living and put everything on YouTube, that doesn't mean that I look at my work and I just think like, cool, that's it. But rather, this genuinely is an ongoing journey toward mastery, toward fulfillment. These are the things that really drive me. So here in this early stage, what I'm doing is I'm just going ahead and I'm killing the white of my canvas. This is helpful because my canvas actually had a little bit of, I think, sun staining. It might not be evident on camera, but you could essentially see a shadow of where some of the canvas had been exposed to sunlight and some of the canvas wasn't. And it had changed color a little bit over time. So what I'm doing here is I'm just establishing a color that is just a little bit less bright, and I'm evening out the tone of the canvas just a little bit. Next thing I want to go ahead and do, I can either start establishing some background information. There's not going to be a lot. It's going to be mostly abstract brushwork. I can either go ahead and establish that, or I can place my subject within the composition. And based on just how, I would say, like, clean this composition is, there's just so much white space. I don't want to make the mistake of, like, already having a lot of background info that ultimately just has to be covered up because I didn't put the drawing down in the right spot. So let's go ahead and just begin by establishing some of that drawing. So this first wash was Gamsol thinned. This is transparent oxide brown plus some ultramarine to get just kind of this gray tone. But now, given that all of this is pretty slick with Gamsol at this point, I'm going to go ahead and actually just use my transparent oxide red here straight out of the tube. And in fact, I would say this transparent oxide red is just like a little unnecessarily hot in temperature. It's just like a little distracting for the color harmony I know I'm going to be going for later. So just to save myself a little bit of effort, I'm going to go ahead and cool that off with a little bit of ultramarine. It's going to make this behave a little bit more like transparent oxide brown. And this is an interesting composition for me because this is actually more about the anatomy of the chest, the hand, the neck, versus the anatomy of the face. So this is a little bit of a challenge, it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone. So I'm already planning with the assumption that I'm going to make some mistakes. That's also part of why I really wanted to ensure that the temperature of this color wasn't too off from the background, because there's a good chance I'm going to be doing some wiping away. Right now, I'm going ahead and I'm putting in the features of the face, just using these like very basic Loomis proportions. So the very top of her head actually isn't going to be visible. Technically, her hairline isn't either, but the way that we would think about this is the eyes being at the midpoint of the skull, and then the placement of the brow bone, the nose, and then the shadow of the lower lip is all going to be divided into even thirds from the hairline down to the chin. So I'm kind of just doing this as a very preliminary test. I'm definitely prepared to be quite wrong. I need to be pretty careful here because I could easily just start painting the face and like checking that information, but it's not so much about getting in the face accurately at this point. It's more about making sure that the overall blocking of the subject and the figure itself into the composition, that is what is much more important at this stage. So I'm going to waste a whole lot of paint and effort, and I'm going to muddy up the canvas if I start really diving in to the painting itself prematurely. So one really easy way I can check this is actually to just do a quick Photoshop overlay. I've demoed this on my channel before. I don't do this when painting from life. But when I'm working from a mock-up that's digital or a digital photograph, I find this is usually the easiest way to check the composition, especially in the case of a mock-up where I've been really thoughtful as far as like where exactly I want the subject to be in the painting. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use that technique now. I will link the video where I walk through how to do this up in the upper right-hand corner for you. So now that I've done this check, I can see that the image is kind of falling down and to the right. I can use some of the marks that I've already made as a bit of a corrective guide. I had the right idea for a lot of these shapes, it's just that overall they weren't placed the way they needed to be. So first things first, this was actually accurate. It just needed to continue up a little bit. And this is actually going to be the back of the neck. I'm going to clean this up right now just by taking a clean dry brush and pushing away the old paint. This is going to make my job easier so I'm not getting confused by old marks. Next, this shadow on the ear overall is just up from all of these other marks, so I can actually just fuzz all of these out. And the ear does extend well past this little darker area, which actually should be about up here. This line actually coincides perfectly with the brow. And then forehead is going to get built on top of this. This should actually be the bottom of the jaw. Hand and the arm were pretty much right. It's just that they were all shifted too far down and to the right. I can go ahead and kind of push some of this paint away, work it back into this Gamsol wash layer. And then same thing with this. My life is going to be made much easier if I accidentally put this brown paint into flesh tone areas versus background areas, because the background is going to be kind of this cool gray color. And then all of this was pretty arbitrary in the first place, so I'm going to go ahead and let all of that go. Same thing with this line, and this one is actually pretty accurate, so I will leave that be. I can go ahead and tune some of this up, just make it a little bit more readable. Now I have to go back into the face, so I think easiest thing is probably just going to be to remove that information and then reestablish where I think all of these important landmarks go, just based on the new ones. So not leaving any of those old lines on there, I think that would just be too confusing. Okay, now let's recheck. And I have more things to correct. This early stage might seem super tedious, and I could absolutely transfer this with like a charcoal or graphite drawing. That's absolutely possible. I just usually find it's kind of just as easy to knock out this stage in paint. Saves me a little bit of time, although I understand that for a lot of folks, by the time you actually get to the easel, you're really antsy to dive in and actually get to start painting. So you can absolutely adapt this, but I do just want to showcase like just how much I truly am caring about the drawing in this early stage versus just kind of going with good enough. All right, so what absolutely sucks is that I put in all this work to really get the features as accurate as I could get them, but they still weren't actually in the right place. And reworking this stuff is messy. So I'm using a little silicone chisel tool. I quite like these, especially if you're working on a non-absorbent surface like this Raymar panel that I have. If you get it at the right angle, it can just really get you back to very close to the white of the canvas, which is tremendously useful. And then just to even it out, make it a little bit less distracting to look at, I can go back in with my clean, dry brush and just take away some of this texture. So this is definitely tedious right now. Like I won't joke around about that. But every little bit of effort that I spend in this stage is really well worth it. I'm having to kind of guess on the placement of this eye. We'll just see next time I check the drawing whether I put this in the right spot. All right, now this is looking more structured, more anatomical. I think I just have more good stuff happening. So let's go ahead. Let's go back to round 2. Let's give this a check. Getting close. That's what I learned from this last little adjustment. So overall, this is looking good. So now you can probably see why I didn't want to have that really warm, transparent oxide red as my block-in color, just because already this area is much warmer than it originally was. Okay, so after checking, I think for the 4th time, I'm gonna be real, I am still not on the mark with this drawing, but I'm also not really feeling the possibility of just continuing to slather on more of this mixture. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to establish an overall flesh tone that I can start working into. I don't have I don't have a singular flesh tone formula per se, because for one, there is no singular flesh tone out in the world. But if I'm painting someone fair, colors that I typically reach for are going to be, from the beginning, it's probably going to be Terra Rosa, Yellow Ochre, and then Titanium White. All the paints that I have out right now are Vasari. And then I'm going to bring down the intensity of this overall flesh tone with some ultramarine blue. And before I actually commit to this, I'm going to avoid making a key mistake that I've made plenty of times in the past, which is I find it really helpful in terms of being able to build a block-in that makes visual sense to go from dark to light, assuming that your canvas is a light area. So what that means is I'm going to mix up some shadow colors first before I go and start laying in the overall color or the lighter areas of her skin tone. And I'm not really worried about doing any genuine painting at this stage. I'm just trying to lay everything in pretty like flat and even, nothing super exciting. No real texture, not even like fancy brushwork at this stage, honestly. Just want something good enough to help me kind of take in the big picture. And as the shadow shape moves toward her back shoulder, it's lightening in value a bit and cooling off. And thankfully, I can accomplish that effect simply by adding some titanium white to my mixture. And then probably go ahead and integrate these so the color is a little bit less warm. Okay, and now I can go ahead and begin with this overall flesh tone. Oh wow, that's so close to my shadow color on the left. I need to differentiate the light flesh tone on the left side from the light flesh tone on the right side. Now this needs to come up pretty substantially. Now I can start to go in to this base flesh tone mixture in the face. And I'm essentially just going to use this for the entire rest of the drawing. I went ahead and I rechecked some of the work I had already done, and so far so good, which is exactly what we want. Now let's get an overall value for the part of the hand that's in the lighter plane. This is going to be pretty similar to that overall flesh tone mixture. I want to make sure I don't accidentally get this too light, but it has a lot of shadow in it. I would think of it as having a lot of blue in it, but that means the mixture itself is pushing toward gray. The blue part of that is just relative. And then the forearm is basically the same as this. So, two things I can go ahead and indicate now would be the shadow under the ear and hopefully placing the eye in the actual correct position. And then hopefully also the eyebrow. So let's go ahead and dive into that. Okay. So far, so good. Next thing is going to be the upper lip, which is going to be a very similar mixture to the back of the ear. It actually looks like these are going to be the same mixture. In fact, it looks like the starting value for this is pretty much just transparent oxide red. Let's actually play around and find out. It's coming along well. I'm going to go ahead and deepen up my indication of the eye here. Seems to be in pretty good order. Now the next thing I can go ahead and do, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to very gently play with this edge, but maybe not with this brush, because this brush feels very stiff for this job. So my hope as I show you this is to demonstrate like just how helpful it is to have the right average shapes of color, because truly I haven't done that much painting. Like I think, I'm just thinking about all the starts and stops in my time here. I think I have maybe like 25 minutes in this painting so far. And already when I look at like the head and the neck, it's coming together. So to further facilitate that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start just to subtly add some color shifts where appropriate. I'm concerning myself a little bit more with value than anything else at this stage. There's definitely some warming up that these colors do as they enter into the light. And I know that the titanium white cools these areas off. So I'm probably going to have to modulate this as I go, or almost certainly I'm going to have to touch this up as I progress through. But this is pretty much good enough for my needs at the moment. And then interestingly, this shoulder color off to the right, it does have a good amount of green in it. So I'm just going to take a touch of Viridian into a mixture that I already know is very close. Like the value is correct and the color looks right, but I think the color is just maybe not quite green or yellow enough. I'm going to go ahead and just lighten up this area. So one thing that I really like to think about when it comes to block-ins is I want the block-in to be a good enough average color that it basically does a lot of the heavy lifting that I'm going to have to do as I bring the painting to a finish already. So for instance, if the color is already in pretty good shape, I'm not going to have to go back and like repaint and repaint and repaint. I can just add a little embellishment on top of the block-in and it's pretty much going to be done. Now, this area is pretty close to the base flesh tone that I've been using in the light parts. So I can go ahead and insert that. And I think from here, the next thing I can take a look at is probably going to be like the tops of the fingers, because that color is just a little bit different from what I've indicated. And I don't want to like lose the structure on the fingers too early, which I'm definitely in danger in doing since I am not as practiced in my hands as I am in faces. Drawing check complete or looking good. Main problem that I found was actually this eyebrow. So let's clean it up. And then the next, like, obvious thing that I would like to address would be the back of the neck. So to do this, I need to go ahead and start with a brush that hasn't been contaminated by a lot of these flesh tone mixtures. I need to mix up something that's going to be a decent bit brighter and warmer. So I'm just starting with a variation on my base skin tone mixture for this piece. So titanium white, yellow ochre, and then a touch of Terra Rosa. That's getting me pretty close to what I want, but I think I'm gonna need maybe just like a pop of something higher chroma. Yeah, it's looking awful pink, so I'm gonna grab some CAD yellow pale. I'm not gonna need much of this at all, but this is gonna help me kind of compensate for any paint mixtures that might be a little duller, while still using a good amount of that titanium white. And already that is doing a better job. So there's a couple things happening here. It's not just this slightly warmer area of lighter value. It's also the fact that as this like falls off toward the back of her neck, it is going toward orange versus going toward more of a purple. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my transparent oxide red mixture and see if I can't kind of shift what's been happening here in the right direction. And by the right direction, I mean more of an orange direction. Color looked right, but the value was off. So I kind of just made like a tentative mark that I'm going to go back in and adjust, just like that. I see a little bit of this color, needs to get even lighter on that forearm, on the forearm too. So like while I have this mixed up, I'm just going to go and work that in. Now, if I had been really organized in how I laid out my palette, I could probably save a tremendous amount of time just through not having to remix certain things. But alas, I am just not that organized. All right, I think the next thing I can go ahead and start doing is establishing some of these background shapes of color. It's not because I've completed my mission in the top part of the painting by any means, or the subject matter rather, but just because I can actually go back and carve a slightly more accurate shape if I can play into the background somewhat. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put aside the brushes I've been using because all of them are contaminated with my flesh tone mixtures, with the exception of my background brush that I used in the very beginning. I'm going to go ahead, make sure my palette knife is clean, and I'm going to mix up color that I often really like using for green backgrounds, which is a mixture of Viridian and then a Gamblin transparent orange. It's a specialty color that I like specifically for this use case. Okay, so that's a little bit yellow. Let me go ahead and just add a touch more Viridian. Also, this mixture is a bit runny. I might have to mix it up elsewhere. This color isn't bad, it's just a little bit intense, and I think that I can probably get it more to where I want it through wiping versus adding white. So, taking out my Viva paper towel, and I'm just taking this color that I've been using. I'm also going to grab a clean, very nicely shaped brush just to help carve out these areas. Because I won't lie, doing it with a paper towel just doesn't seem ideal. Okay, color is definitely darker than I want, which means I'm gonna have to erase it so it doesn't look like she's exhaling green vapor. So far so good. This color is just a little bit too intense. So I can actually just take a clean brush with Gamsol and lift some of this out. And my suspicion is that just by lifting some of this, the chroma will go down. So I might not actually have to like dull the color. So I'm actually kind of frequently looking back in my camera monitor, just because it's actually a very easy way to see a very small version of the painting without me backing up and potentially like tripping over some camera equipment. So I'm using this to my advantage in this stage. This is something that I often talk about with students. They will find that when they upload a painting for me to give feedback on, as soon as they upload it for me to take a look at, they see all the problems with it. And some of it is just your eye really sharpens as soon as you know that someone else is going to be taking a look at your work. But the bigger cause of this is actually much simpler. It's just that when someone is uploading their painting for me to take a look at, they're actually seeing it in thumbnail form. Another way to think about this is that they're seeing it at approximately the same scale that they would see it at if they were regularly backing up and walking across the room. So this is your friendly reminder to make sure that you're regularly backing up and walking across the room. It makes a tremendous difference. And now I realize a flaw in my plan, so I'm working off of a reference where she's not actually wearing anything on her head, but I am kind of vaguely suggesting a hat on her head. I theoretically will be able to get away with this only because the hat will be very, very vaguely suggested, but I still have to actually have a clear reference to work off of, which I did not actually do. So I'm going to go do my homework real quick so I can actually bring this thing closer to completion. Of course, I say that, and then suddenly I decide I want to go ahead and mass in a darker area back here for the sake of balancing out the composition a little bit. So now I'm actually at the stage where I have put the thumbnail of my painting and my reference up on the screen, and I'm looking at it like actually at thumbnail size. That is kind of the stage of the game here. And what it's helping me to do is to see kind of like big picture problems. At the very least, I would describe them largely as big picture differences. So I'm doing what I can at the moment to go ahead and make some adjustments to my background design with that in mind. kind of want this idea in this piece that it's like you're entering a dream or a memory. I think that's part of why I really like paintings that don't have explicitly suggested backgrounds. It's more like being loosely evoked. So first thing I'm seeing that I think is a problem is actually the color temperature of the shadow on the hand. So let's go ahead and address that. I think the color is good, just seems like the value is dark. The next thing I need to do is I need to go ahead and deepen up some of these flesh tone colors in the face, which is going to be tricky because overall it's not bad, but it's just a touch too light. So there's a few different colors happening in her face, and they're very, very subtle. And I can see them, but I'm going to have to kind of sneak up on them in order to really capture them in the piece. So after a couple days break, and I should preface that I don't typically enjoy taking long breaks between painting sessions. When possible, I really like to do everything wet into wet. But in this case, I just happened to hit a wall with this painting. And I have found that while there is genuine benefit to pushing through for the sake of being able to, really just finish a painting in one sitting and take advantage of everything being wet and the kind of like brush strokes that you can get in that situation, there's a real balance between that and just managing energy and attention. And in my case, I realized that if I had kept painting on this in one session, I really would have had diminishing returns. So what I did was I went ahead and took a break from this. When I came back to it, everything was pretty dry. And honestly, at this point, what I did to help take me to a finish was I really compared the painting that I had been working on to my reference. And I honestly just started going through some very simple questions. So, does this look different than my reference based on the value? Does this look different based on the drawing? Now, in this case, you saw me really fight through some challenges with the drawing in the beginning. So by the time I was coming back to this piece, there weren't major drawing problems that I had to contend with. But if the drawing is messed up, it doesn't matter if I put down the perfect brushstroke or the perfect color, I'm going to have to move it eventually. So I'm really prioritizing that drawing piece first. Then I'm letting value do the most heavy lifting after that point. It doesn't matter so much if I get the perfect color, so long as the value is accurate and the color is vaguely in the color family that it needs to be. This should continue to look more realistic. If the drawing and value are working, I should be in pretty good shape. And I would say even more than that, when I was at the point where the drawing and value were working, it started to become more obvious if I was genuinely experiencing a challenge with color. And then when I sat down to plan this piece, you'll see the reference I was working from. This is a Howard Lyon reference. For most of bringing this piece to a finish, I'm really just thinking about the figure. I had mocked up a way to leave the background very abstracted and simplified. And I knew that that background was going to have very, very loose brushwork and that there were going to be certain interactions between the subject and the background that would be looser. But I also knew that I wanted a good amount of realism in the subject herself. And what that actually meant was that I wasn't having to do a whole lot of playing with edges within the figure. I actually allowed the edges to stay pretty tight here. So that really helped to guide me to the end. It was almost like by the time I got to this part in the painting, I really wasn't having to make too many artistic compositional choices, and instead I could focus much more on just getting this to the point where it looked as realistic as I wanted to, and I could leave a lot of my earlier work just simply to be abstract and painterly, and then the final piece would really embody that balance. And so that is how I went ahead and wrapped up the end of this. Now, one thing I want to note is you are watching the shortened version of this painting. So, while this might look like it took just under an hour watching it from YouTube, this was probably about a 4 or 5 hour painting. But to get to that finish, I really am just thinking in terms of very, very simple, straightforward questions. I made sure that I set myself up for success with a really good reference and a very clear plan right from the beginning of this creative project. And then by the time I'm getting closer and closer to the finish, I'm actually asking myself not so much about like, where should I add a flourish or how should I loosen it up? Because I actually took care of so much of that right at the beginning. And instead, I'm just asking those very simple questions. Is the drawing accurate? Does something need to go up or down? Is the value right? Or does this need to be lighter or darker? If both of those things are working, does the color need to be adjusted? And in my case, a lot of the color adjustments I made were taking something a little bit more toward blue or a little bit more toward yellow so that her skin tone didn't look quite so pink everywhere. And then another part of that is really taking the saturation down so that it doesn't look too bright and too garish and really lose that sense of realism. And again, the final thing here would typically be edges, but because I had planned out so many of the edges in the beginning, I could honestly leave a lot of my edges just as they came out naturally because I set myself up for success in this way. I went ahead and put in the looseness early so I could really afford to get very tight and detailed at the end without the overall piece looking overworked. So I hope seeing this full process was really illuminating, but I know it's also just the beginning. If you would like my help being able to do this kind of artwork for yourself or to achieve your unique version of this kind of loose, expressive approach to painting portraits, I would love to help. I'm putting a link down in the description to book a free consultation call directly with me so that you and I can discuss your painting goals and find out if and how we would be a fit to work together to help you to reach those goals. I really look forward to hearing from you. If you have any questions about this painting, let me know down in the comments. And until next week, happy painting, everybody.